I don't have to tell any of you what a long and difficult year this past year has been. Many of us have been physically separated from friends and family throughout that whole time. Schools shut down and parents were suddenly responsible for their children's virtual learning. The responsibility for that tended to fall more heavily on mothers, and women have disproportionately had to put careers on hold during the pandemic. Teachers have been stressed to the max. They've had to learn how to do virtual learning, and now they've had to learn how to do hybrid learning, all the while worrying about their students and their own safety. For some, the loneliness of the pandemic has been overwhelming. Working alone from home, isolated from others, seeing people only on Zoom, it is just too much. For others, the constant togetherness as couples has been too much. Often with children always there, it has put a great strain on many relationships. Then came the murder of George Floyd and the wave of protest around the country and around the world. The need to reckon with the legacy of slavery, with the white supremacist foundations of our nations, to address white supremacy's continuing being woven in, still being woven into the structures of our culture, our legal system, our churches, the educational system, the neighborhoods, the economy, pushed its way into the cultural consciousness. Throw in a little partisan political dysfunction, a presidential election filled with bizarre conspiracy theories, and an attempted insurrection. And it's a wonder our collective mental health isn't worse than it is. I've had the luxury here at the church of being able to come into the office every day during the pandemic. But the stresses of this time have taken their toll on me as well. When I've talked to colleagues, they speak of a tiredness that no amount of sleep can cure, and I've certainly experienced that. I've often felt on the edge of burnout, and so I suppose I was not in the best frame of mind to hear the words of Lenny Duncan when I listened to his keynote address at the next church gathering, the national gathering, held virtually, of course. The Reverend Duncan is a black Lutheran pastor, an author of the book, Dear Church, a love letter from a black preacher to the whitest denomination in the U.S. Duncan doesn't really fit the mold of what a lot of us think of as a pastor. He's been homeless and incarcerated, and his speech is peppered with profanities. But what he says is hard to ignore. It's also hard to hear. He says that while God is always on the side of the oppressed, the church as religious institution inevitably sides with the state against love and any love movement. He says that the church is far too invested in institution, and that there's a worldwide spiritual awakening going on that the church scarcely even notices. But the thing that hit me the hardest was when he said this: the church on earth is no longer God's chosen vessel. He said that broke his heart, but that did not really soften the blow much for me. Not God's chosen vessel? Could that be true? I thought back on all those times when I've spoken during the pandemic of the church building being closed, but the church being open. I've been quite proud of the way that there's been so much ministry and activity going on here during the pandemic, but if we can truly be the church without the building, what does it mean that we've invested so much time and money and energy in so much building? We say that we are followers of Jesus, a countercultural troublemaker who so enraged the religious authorities and the state that they killed him. If we're his followers, it would make sense that we would look something like him, but we don't look very countercultural. And rarely are we troublemakers who enrage the powers that be. I couldn't help but think of Lenny Duncan and his critique of the church when I first saw our Old Testament reading for this morning from the prophet Jeremiah. If Reverend Duncan says some things that church people don't really want to hear, the words of the prophet Jeremiah so enraged his audience that he was arrested, imprisoned, and threatened with death on multiple occasions. He was declared a traitor for calling on the people not to resist the Babylonians. And he was rightly understood to be a prophet of doom and gloom for his constant words of judgment, for his insisting that Israel would be defeated and would go into exile, the natural consequences of their failure to be the people they were called to be. He was quite naturally seen as a doom and gloom prophet for his attacks on both priest and on king. But despite all of that, Jeremiah never completely gave up on Israel. His hope was not rooted in some sort of latent goodness of Israel itself. His hope was rooted in God's commitment to Israel and to humankind. The days are surely coming, says Yahweh, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. It will not be like the covenant that I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, a covenant that they broke. But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says Yahweh. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their people. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Israel had a heart problem, a condition that could only be cured by transforming the heart. The heart wants what it wants, or else it does not care, Emily Dickinson famously wrote. But the wants of Israel's heart had led to destruction. And only a transformed heart, whose wants mirrored those of God's, could set things right. I wonder how our wants, how well they line up with God's wants, with Jesus' wants. Ideally, they should be very similar. But the church is often worried about status and prestige and appearance, while none of those mattered much at all to Jesus. Especially in a time of church decline, congregations and denominations worry endlessly about institutional survival. We fret over budgets and whether or not there'll be enough money. But Jesus says we should be willing to lose our lives for the sake of the gospel. Upstanding citizen, upstanding member of the community has practically become a synonym for church membership. But I doubt seriously Jesus was ever referred to in such terms. And the term Christian itself has come to mean little more than halfway decent. As when a neighbor of America's latest mass murderer said, they come across as a good Christian family. Like Israel, the church often has a heart problem. Our wants, our desires, our priorities do not line up with God's, do not look much at all like God's. Perhaps we need God to write on our hearts, to transform our hearts so that our wants mirror those of Jesus. Perhaps we need to let go of institutional assumptions and conventions and allow Jesus to live and to work through us. That is possible, you know. When he writes to the church in Rome, the Apostle Paul speaks of the transformation that happens to us through Jesus. He talks about the hope that emerges even in the midst of suffering, adding, and hope does not disappoint us because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit that has been given to us. And as a result, he goes on to say, those who once lived in ways counter to God's desires have become obedient from the heart. The Holy Spirit, the presence of the risen Christ poured into us, can transform us, can make us long to be more and more like Jesus, to actually look more and more like Jesus, and let the world see Jesus in us. That is what it means to be God's chosen vessel. And that is what we are called to be. Not a religious institution, not a pillar of the community, not a lovely building, but the living presence of the risen Christ, who shows the world a different way, a radically countercultural way, a way that will cause trouble, the way of Jesus. But that will take transformed hearts. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Yes, God, please, please.